The cornfields stretched endlessly, an ocean of golden stalks swaying gently under a sky painted with the colors of dusk. It was one of those evenings where the world seemed to pause, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The air carried the faint scent of earth and drying leaves, mingling with the distant hum of crickets beginning their nightly symphony. In this quiet corner of the countryside, life moved at a slower pace, untouched by the chaos of cities and modernity. But on this particular evening, something unusual stirred within the fields. Something that would leave an indelible mark on everyone who dared to listen. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? It began with a woman named Emilia, woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by these sprawling acres of corn. She knew the land like the back of her hand, every row, every bend, every hidden corner. But even familiarity couldn't prepare her for what she would encounter that night. Emily had been out late, tending to some final chores before heading back to the farmhouse. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, and the first stars were just beginning to peek through the darkening veil above. As she walked along the edge of the property, her boots crunching softly against the dry soil, she heard it. A sound so faint at first that she thought it might be her imagination whisper, almost imperceptible, carried by the breeze. At first, she dismissed it, chalking it up to the rustling of leaves or the creaking of wooden fences in the distance. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakable, voices. They were coming from deep within the cornfield. Emily froze, her heart pounded in her chest. The voices were not loud, but they were clear enough to send a shiver down her spine. They spoke in hushed tones, overlapping one another in a chaotic jumble of words she couldn't quite make out. There was no mistaking it. They were human voices, yet they sounded strange. Distorted, as if filtered through layers of static. She glanced around, searching for any sign of movement, but the field stood silent and still, save for the gentle sway of the cornstalks. Curiosity battled with fear inside her. Part of her wanted to turn and run to retreat to the safety of the farmhouse and pretend she hadn't heard anything. But another part, the part that had grown up exploring these fields, knowing every inch of them, refused to let her ignore it. Gathering her courage, she stepped into the cornfield, pushing aside the tall stalks as she ventured deeper into the labyrinth of green and gold. The further she went, the more pronounced the voices became. They weren't calling out to her, nor did they seem aware of her presence. Instead, they whispered among themselves, fragments of sentences floating through the air. "Don't look! Too late! They're watching." The words sent a chill racing down her spine, each one more unsettling than the last. She tried to focus, to piece together what they were saying, but the voices shifted and changed, slipping away like smoke before she could grasp their meaning. And then, abruptly, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the area, her eyes straining to pierce the growing darkness. That's when she saw a figure standing amidst the stalks, partially obscured by the shadows. It was humanoid in shape, but something about it was wrong. Its posture was unnaturally stiff, its head tilted at an angle that made her stomach churn. She called out, her voice trembling, "Who's there?" There was no response. The figure remained motionless, as if carved from stone. Emily took a cautious step forward, her pulse hammering in her ears. Just as she was about to call out again, the figure turned and disappeared into the corn, not walking, not running, but vanishing as though it had never been there at all. Panic surged through her veins, and she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste to retreat. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the field, gasping for air as she leaned against the fence. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Was it a prank? Some kind of elaborate hoax? Or was it something else entirely? When she finally mustered the strength to tell her family about the incident, they listened with a mixture of skepticism and unease. Her father, a grizzled man with hands calloused from years of labor, dismissed it as nothing more than her imagination playing tricks on her. "You've been working too hard," he said gruffly. "Get some rest, and you'll feel better in the morning." But her younger brother, Jake, wasn't so quick to brush it off. He had always been the curious type, the one who loved hearing tales of the strange and unexplained. His eyes lit up as she recounted the story, and he insisted they investigate further. The next evening, armed with flashlights and a sense of determination, Emily and Jake ventured back into the cornfield. The atmosphere felt different this time, heavier, charged with an almost electric tension. The usual sounds of the countryside, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. As they moved deeper into the field, the whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. Jake gripped Emily's arm, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" She nodded, unable to speak. The voices were clearer now, more insistent, as if urging them forward. Against her better judgment, Emily led the way, following the sound deeper into the heart of the cornfield. What they found there defied explanation. In a small clearing, surrounded by towering stalks, stood a circle of stones arranged in a crude pattern. The ground within the circle was scorched black, as though it had been burned, though there was no smell of smoke or ash. And etched into the largest stone was a single word carved deeply into the surface: "Listen." Before either of them could react, the voices erupted into a cacophony of sound, overwhelming and disorienting. Emily and Jake clutched each other, their flashlights flickering wildly as the world around them seemed to warp and twist. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, fleeting glimpses of figures moving just beyond the light. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise ceased, leaving them alone once more. Shaken but alive, they fled the field, vowing never to return. But the experience left its mark on them, lingering in their thoughts long after the initial shock had faded. The whispers followed them, faint echoes that crept into their dreams and haunted their waking hours. No matter how far they ran, the voices in the cornfield refused to let them go. Years passed, and the story of the mysterious voices spread throughout the community, whispered in hushed tones over kitchen tables and campfires. Some claimed to have seen strange lights hovering above the fields at night, while others reported hearing disembodied cries carried on the wind. The cornfield became a place of legend, avoided by most and feared by all. Yet, despite the warnings, people continued to venture into the field, drawn by morbid curiosity or a desire to uncover the truth. None ever returned unchanged, their faces pale and haunted, their eyes hollow with secrets they refused to share. The voices, it seemed, had a way of finding those who sought them out, pulling them into their web of mystery and madness. And so the legend lives on, a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. The cornfield remains, silent and watchful, waiting for its next visitor to heed the call of the voices within. The small town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, it was a quiet community where life moved at its own unhurried pace. The townsfolk were simple people farmers, shopkeepers, teachers who took pride in their traditions and the bonds they shared. But beneath the surface of this idyllic existence lay secrets, whispers of things that couldn't be explained, stories passed down through generations like heirlooms no one dared to touch. It was here, in this sleepy corner of the world, that the story of the man who vanished twice began. A tale so strange, so unsettling, that even decades later it still lingered in the air, spoken of only in hushed tones when the night grew dark and the wind howled through the trees. It started with a man named Thomas. He wasn't remarkable in any way. at least not outwardly. Average height, brown hair streaked with gray, hands calloused from years of labor. He lived alone on the outskirts of town, in a modest cabin tucked away among the pines. People often described him as quiet, reserved, someone who preferred solitude over company. But despite his reclusive nature, Thomas had always been friendly enough, nodding politely when passing neighbors or exchanging pleasantries at the local market. One autumn evening, under a sky heavy with storm clouds, Thomas disappeared without a trace. No note left behind, no signs of struggle, just gone. His absence went unnoticed for nearly 2 days, until Mrs. Harper, the elderly woman who ran the bakery down the road, grew concerned when he failed to pick up his usual loaf of sourdough bread. She knocked on his door, called out his name, but received no answer. When she peeked through the window, she found the cabin empty, the fire cold, as though no one had been there for some time. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek, and soon the entire town was abuzz with speculation. Some thought he might have simply left, tired of the monotony of small-town life. Others whispered darker theories that he'd fallen victim to foul play, or worse, something beyond human comprehension. Search parties combed the woods, the riverbanks, every inch of land within miles, but there was no sign of him. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. For weeks, the mystery weighed heavily on the townsfolk. Conversations revolved around what could have happened to Thomas, and many found themselves glancing nervously toward the forest whenever twilight fell. Then, just as hope began to fade, something extraordinary occurred. He reappeared. On a crisp morning, the sun casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground, Thomas walked into the center of town as though nothing unusual had happened. His clothes were disheveled, his face gaunt, but otherwise he seemed unharmed. The sight of him sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. People gathered around him, bombarding him with questions, demanding to know where he had been, what had happened, but Thomas offered little explanation. "I don't remember," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes distant. "I woke up in the woods. I don't know how I got there." The townsfolk weren't satisfied. How could someone vanish for weeks and then return without answers? Suspicion hung thick in the air, and while some believed Thomas's story, others weren't so sure. Whispers of madness, deception, even supernatural forces began to circulate. Yet despite the unease, life slowly returned to normal, as close to normal as it could get after such an event. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Months passed, and the memory of Thomas's disappearance began to fade. The townsfolk stopped talking about it, chalking it up to one of those inexplicable things best left undisturbed. Thomas himself tried to move on, resuming his quiet routine, avoiding prying eyes and uncomfortable questions. But deep down, something was different about him. He rarely spoke, avoided crowds, and spent most of his time wandering the edges of the forest, staring into the trees as though searching for something or someone. Then, one winter's night, it happened again. This time, there were witnesses. 2 hunters, brothers named Daniel and Samuel, were tracking deer near the edge of the forest when they saw him. They described it later as though recounting a nightmare. Thomas standing at the tree line, his silhouette illuminated by the pale light of the moon. Before they could call out to him, he turned and stepped into the wood sand, vanished. One moment, he was there. The next, he was gone, as though the shadows themselves had swallowed him. The hunters rushed back to town, their faces pale, their voices trembling as they recounted what they had seen. Panic rippled through Willow Creek once more. Search parties were organized immediately, lanterns lit, dogs brought in to track his scent, but as before, there was no trace of him. No footprints in the snow, no broken branches, nothing to indicate where he had gone. Days turned into weeks, and hope dwindled. Many assumed Thomas was gone for good this time, lost forever to whatever force had claimed him twice. Funerals were planned, Memorials held, though no body was ever recovered. The townsfolk mourned, but beneath their grief lingered a gnawing fear that whatever had taken Thomas might come for them next. And then, just as despair reached its peak, he returned. The second reappearance was even more shocking than the first. This time, Thomas didn't walk into town quietly. He stumbled out of the forest in broad daylight, his clothes torn, his skin scratched and bruised. His eyes were wild, darting frantically as though searching for an escape. He collapsed in the middle of Main Street, gasping for air, muttering incoherently. Townsfolk rushed to his side, trying to calm him, but he pushed them away, shouting in a voice raw with terror. "They're real! They're watching me!" he screamed, tears streaming down his face. "They won't let me go!" No one knew what to make of his words. Who were they? What did he mean by watching? Doctors examined him, but aside from exhaustion and dehydration, they found no physical injuries. Psychologists suggested trauma, hallucinations, anything to explain his erratic behavior, yet Thomas insisted he was telling the truth. Over the following days, he pieced together fragments of his memory, sharing them hesitantly with those brave enough to listen. He spoke of a Placee realm hidden within the forest, accessible only through certain paths known only to them. He described beings that defied description, creatures neither fully human nor animal, whose presence filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. They communicated not with words, but with feelings, emotions so intense they threatened to overwhelm his mind. Fear, despair, loneliness. And above all, hunger. A hunger that consumed everything it touched. Thomas claimed these beings had marked him somehow, chosen him for reasons he couldn't understand. They allowed him to leave, but only temporarily, pulling him back whenever they willed it. Each time, the experience left him weaker, more fragile, as though they were draining something vital from him. He begged the townsfolk to help him, to find a way to break their hold. But no one knew what to do. How could they fight something they couldn't see, couldn't comprehend? As weeks turned into months, Thomas became increasingly unstable. He stopped sleeping, afraid of what awaited him in his dreams. He barricaded himself inside his cabin, refusing to venture outside unless absolutely necessary. Sometimes, late at night, townsfolk swore they could hear him screaming, pleading with unseen forces to leave him alone. Other times, they reported seeing lights flickering in the distance, deep within the forest, accompanied by faint, unearthly sounds that made their blood run cold. Eventually, Thomas disappeared for a third time, and this time he never came back. His cabin remains abandoned to this day, a grim reminder of the man who vanished twice. Some say his spirit still lingers in the woods, trapped between worlds, forever haunted by the beings that claimed him. Others believe the forest itself has changed since his disappearance, growing darker, more sinister, as though infected by the same malevolent force that took him. To this day, the people of Willow Creek avoid the forest after sunset. They speak of shadows that move when they shouldn't, of whispers carried on the wind, of eyes watching from the trees. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the air is thick with silence, they swear they can hear his voice, faint and desperate, calling out from somewhere beyond. The man who vanished twice remains a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of our understanding and the price we pay for venturing too far into the unknown. A stranger in the mirror. It was a cold, gray morning when it all began. The kind of morning where the world feels muted, as though the sky itself is holding its breath. In a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, life moved slowly, predictably. People woke at dawn, went about their routines, and returned home as dusk painted the horizon in hues of orange and purple. But for one man, whose name was Daniel, that predictable rhythm of life shattered in an instant, shattered by something so ordinary, yet so profoundly unsettling that it would haunt him until his final days. Daniel lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town. He wasn't particularly remarkable. He worked as a mechanic, kept to himself, and spent most evenings reading or tinkering with old radios he found at yard sales. His neighbors liked him well enough. He was polite, if a little reserved, but they didn't know much about him beyond the basics. He had moved to town years ago, seeking solitude after what he vaguely described as a difficult time. No one pressed him for details. Small towns have a way of respecting privacy even when curiosity simmers beneath the surface. That morning, Daniel woke later than usual. The chill in the air seeped through the cracks in the windows, wrapping itself around him like a damp blanket. He shuffled into the bathroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and turned on the light. The fluorescent bulb flickered faintly before casting its harsh glow over the room. And then, as he leaned closer to the mirror to examine a cut on his cheek, he froze. Something was off. At first, he thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on him. Maybe the shadows cast by the uneven lighting were distorting his reflection. But as he stared harder, squinting to make sense of what he saw, he realized the truth. The face staring back at him wasn't quite right. It looked like him, yes, same angular jawline, same thinning hair, but there was something subtly different. The tilt of the head, the curve of the lips, the way the eyes seemed to glimmer with an unfamiliar intensity, it was as though someone else was wearing his skin. Daniel blinked, shaking his head. "This can't be real," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling slightly. He stepped back, then forward again, trying to shake the feeling that this stranger in the mirror wasn't simply a trick of perception. But no matter how many times he adjusted his position, tilted his head, or forced himself to look away and glance back, the anomaly remained. The longer he stared, the more pronounced it became, the subtle differences growing sharper, more distinct, until it felt less like looking at a reflection and more like confronting another person entirely. Panic bubbled up inside him, hot and suffocating. He slammed his palm against the counter, startling himself, and yet the figure in the mirror didn't flinch. Its expression stayed eerily calm, almost serene, as if it were observing him with detached curiosity. "What do you want?" Daniel whispered hoarsely, his breath fogging the glass. For a moment, the figure's lips curled upward. Not quite a smile, but something darker, more knowing. Then, as suddenly as the sensation had begun, it vanished. The mirror returned to normal, reflecting only Daniel's pale, frightened face. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. Was he losing his mind? Hallucinations weren't uncommon, especially after periods of stress or poor sleep, but this had felt too vivid, too tangible, to dismiss outright. Shaking his head, he resolved to put it out of his mind. Fatigue, he told himself. That's all it was, just fatigue. But deep down, he knew better. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though Daniel couldn't shake the nagging unease that clung to him like a second shadow. Every time he caught sight of his reflection in a window, a puddle, even the polished chrome of a car bumper, he tensed, half expecting to see that stranger staring back at him again. But nothing happened. By evening, he convinced himself it had been a fleeting moment of irrational fear, nothing more. That night, however, everything changed. Daniel had always been a light sleeper, prone to waking at the slightest noise. So when he heard the soft creak of floorboards outside his bedroom door, he sat bolt upright, his pulse racing. The house was silent otherwise, save for the occasional groan of wood settling in the cool night air. He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and crept toward the door, peering cautiously into the hallway. Nothing, just darkness stretching endlessly down the corridor. Relieved but still unsettled, Daniel retreated to bed. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts drifted back to the mirror. Try as he might, he couldn't banish the image of that other face from his mind. It lingered at the edges of his consciousness, taunting him, daring him to question his own sanity. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he got up and padded barefoot into the bathroom. The mirror greeted him with perfect clarity now, reflecting only his tired, anxious features. Sighing heavily, he leaned against the sink. "You're fine," he murmured to himself, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Just fine." And then, without warning, the temperature in the room plummeted. A sharp intake of breath escaped Daniel's lips as frost began to creep across the edges of the mirror, spreading inward like icy vines. Before he could react, the surface rippled as though it were liquid rather than glass, and from within that shifting, shimmering plane, a figure emerged. It was him, or rather, it looked like him. Same build, same face, same clothes, but its presence radiated something unnatural, something wrong. Its movements were fluid yet mechanical, deliberate yet devoid of humanity. It stepped closer, pressing its hands against the mirror as though testing the barrier between them. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with terror. The figure tilted its head, studying him with an unnerving calmness. Then, slowly, deliberately, it spoke not with words, but directly into his mind. "I am you." "No!" Daniel shouted, shaking his head violently. "That's not possible." "I've always been here," the voice continued, smooth and insidious. "Waiting, watching." Daniel backed away, his legs hitting the edge of the bathtub. "Get out of my house!" he screamed, grabbing the nearest Objecta bottle of shampoo and hurling it at the mirror. The glass shattered instantly, shards scattering across the floor. Panting, Daniel waited for the figure to vanish, to confirm that it had been nothing more than a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But instead, the pieces of broken glass began to glow softly, each fragment containing a miniature reflection of the intruder. They moved in unison, crawling across the floor like insects surrounding him. Daniel tried to scramble to his feet, but the shards formed a tight circle around him, trapping him in place. One by one, the reflections merged together, coalescing into a single towering form that loomed over him. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, pinning him with their gaze. "You cannot escape me," it hissed, its voice reverberating through the room like a chorus of whispers. "We are bound together now." With a strangled cry, Daniel lunged for the door, but the creature was faster. It reached out, its fingers brushing against his forehead, and everything went black. When Daniel woke, sunlight streamed through the cracks in the curtains. For a brief, blissful moment, he thought it had all been a dream. But as he sat up, grogginess giving way to clarity, he noticed something strange. His hands, they looked different somehow. Smaller, paler, with faint scars he didn't recognize. Confused, he staggered to the bathroom, avoiding the remains of the shattered mirror still littering the floor. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. The face staring back at him was not his own. It belonged to the stranger, the imposter, who had invaded his home, his mind, his very existence. Panic surged through him as he clawed at his cheeks, desperate to wake from whatever twisted reality he had fallen into. But the reflection remained unchanged, mocking him with its familiarity. Outside, the world carried on as usual. Birds chirped, cars rumbled past, and neighbors exchanged cheerful greetings. To everyone else, Daniel was still Daniel. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something had taken root inside him, something ancient and malevolent. And try as he might, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was growing stronger with each passing day. Over the weeks that followed, Daniel became increasingly withdrawn. He avoided mirrors, dreading the sight of that alien face staring back at him. Yet no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the changes kept coming. Subtle at first, this handwriting grew neater, his posture straighter, but soon they became impossible to deny. His mannerisms shifted, his speech patterns altered, and even his memories began to blur, replaced by fragments of a life he didn't recognize. Desperate for answers, Daniel sought help from anyone who would listen. Doctors dismissed his claims as delusions, prescribing medication to ease his anxiety. Friends grew distant, unsure how to comfort him. Even the local priest, whom Daniel visited in a last-ditch attempt to find solace, could offer little more than vague reassurances about faith and redemption. But the worst part, the part that haunted him most, was the knowledge that the entity hadn't left. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, whispering in the quiet moments when no one else was around. Sometimes, late at night, he would catch glimpses of it in reflective surfaces, watching him with those same cold, calculating eyes. Other times, he would wake to find cryptic messages scrawled on scraps of paper scattered across his bedroom floor. "You will forget. You will obey. Soon, we will be whole." By the time winter arrived, Daniel was barely recognizable as the man he once was. His personality had eroded, replaced by a hollow shell that mimicked human behavior while harboring something far darker. The townsfolk noticed, of course they always did, but they attributed his decline to depression, loneliness, anything but the truth. After all, how could they possibly understand? On the coldest night of the year, when snow blanketed the ground and the wind howled like a wounded animal, Daniel disappeared. His house stood empty, untouched, except for a single shard of broken mirror lying on the bathroom floor. When held up to the light, it revealed not Daniel's face, but the smug, triumphant grin of the stranger who had claimed him. To this day, the people of the town speak of Daniel in hushed tones, their voices tinged with pity and unease. Some say his spirit lingers, trapped between worlds, forever fighting to reclaim what was stolen from him. Others believe the mirror itself holds some kind of curse, waiting patiently for its next victim. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. Sometimes, the greatest horrors don't come from outside, they come from within. The old motel sat at the edge of a desolate stretch of highway, its faded sign creaking in the wind. Once a bustling stop for weary travelers, it had long since fallen into disrepair, its cracked windows and peeling paint serving as a grim testament to decades of neglect. Few ventured near it anymore. Those who did often spoke of an oppressive stillness that seemed to cling to the building, a weight in the air that made their skin crawl. It was here, in this forgotten place, that the story of Buried Beneath Room 6 began, a tale whispered in hushed tones by locals, passed down like a ghostly heirloom from one generation to the next. It started with a man named Henry. He wasn't remarkable in any way average height, thinning hair, hands roughened by years of manual labor. A drifter by necessity rather than choice, he had spent most of his adult life bouncing between odd jobs and cheap accommodations, always searching for something he couldn't quite name. When he arrived at the motel late one evening, the receptionist barely looked up from her magazine as she handed him a key. "Room 6, she said flatly, her voice devoid of warmth or curiosity. The room was on the ground floor, tucked away in a corner where the shadows seemed to gather thicker than elsewhere. Henry didn't think much of it. To him, the motel was just another stop along the endless roto-roof over his head for the night, nothing more. But as he stepped inside room 6 and closed the door behind him, he felt it immediately, a strange heaviness in the air, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The room was small and sparsely furnished, a sagging bed, a rickety dresser, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, but it wasn't the furnishings that caught his attention. It was the smell. Faint but unmistakable, it lingered beneath the musty odor of damp carpet and mildew. Earth. Freshly turned earth. Henry frowned, setting his duffel bag on the bed. He glanced around the room, trying to locate the source of the scent, but everything appeared normal as such a dilapidated space could be. Shaking off the unease, he decided it was probably nothing. Maybe someone had tracked mud inside recently, or perhaps the pipes beneath the floorboards were leaking groundwater. Whatever the case, it wasn't worth dwelling on. Exhausted from days of driving, he collapsed onto the mattress, fully intending to sleep until morning. But sleep wouldn't come. As the hours dragged on, the silence of the motel grew heavier, pressing against his ears like a physical force. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, the product of too many restless nights and empty highways, but then he heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere below him. Scraping, dragging, like nails being pulled slowly across wood. Henry sat upright, his heart pounding. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the muffled hum of insects outside the window. He told himself it was nothing settling beams, shifting foundations, any number of mundane explanations. Yet, despite his efforts to rationalize it, the sound returned moments later, louder this time. Closer. Swallowing hard, Henry slid off the bed and knelt on the floor, pressing his ear against the cold linoleum. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, accompanied now by soft, muffled thuds. His stomach churned as realization dawned. Whatever was making the noise was directly beneath him. Trembling, he grabbed the flashlight from his bag and inspected the floorboards. They were warped and splintered, some loose enough to lift with minimal effort. For several minutes, he hesitated, torn between curiosity and mounting dread. Finally, unable to resist, he pried up one of the boards and shone the light into the darkness below. What he saw made his blood run cold. Beneath the floor was a shallow cavity, hastily dug and filled with dirt, and protruding from the soil, pale and lifeless, was a hand. Henry scrambled backward, his breath hitching in his throat. The fingers were stiff, the nails cracked and dirty, as though they had clawed desperately at the earth before succumbing to whatever fate awaited them. He stared at the grisly discovery, paralyzed by shock and horror. What was buried there? How long had it been trapped beneath the motel, and why hadn't anyone noticed? Before he could process these questions, the scraping resumed, louder and more frantic than before. This time, it came not from below, but from all around him, from the walls, the ceiling, even the very air itself. Shadows danced across the room, twisting and writhing like living things, while the temperature plummeted so sharply that his breath formed visible clouds. Panicked, Henry tried to replace the floorboard, hoping against hope that whatever lurked beneath wouldn't notice him, but it was too late. A low, guttural moan echoed through the room, reverberating in his chest like a heartbeat. The hand in the dirt twitched, its fingers curling weakly as though reaching for him. Then, with a sickening squelch, the rest of the arm emerged, followed by a torso caked in mud and decay. Henry stumbled to his feet, fumbling for the door, but it refused to budge no matter how hard he pulled. The creature dragged itself fully into the room, its hollow eyes locking onto him with an intensity that froze him in place. "Help me," it rasped, its voice raw and broken. "I'm still alive." By the time the sun rose, room 6 stood empty, its door wide open and its floorboards intact once more. The motel staff found no trace of Henry, nor any evidence of the thing he had unearthed. Some speculated that he had fled during the night, unable to endure the oppressive atmosphere of the motel. Others believed something far darker had occurred, that the